Good morning, everyone. Thank you very, very much for coming. I'm Jon Ingold. I'm the narrative director of Inkle. We're a fairly small studio that makes narrative games, but I'm very aware of the rule that no one has ever heard of your indie game. So in case you've never heard of us, why are you here? But thank you for coming. But I've made a little list of our titles to date. We've been around for about 11 years. So hopefully, even if you don't know me or you don't know us, you might have come across some of these games, and hopefully you've encountered and interacted with some of them. They're quite varied in terms of their gameplay. We tend to get a little bit bored after finishing a project and then go and do something a bit different. So our first set of games, which is the Sorcery series, is a sort of souped-up choose-your-own-adventure thing. Heaven's Vault is a 3D adventure game. Pendragon is a tactics game. Overboard is a you killed your husband, can you get away with it game. But the one thing that they all have in common is that they're all machines designed to tell you stories. That's our kind of starting point. Each one of these games is there really to lure you in, hook you, captivate you with the world and the characters, hopefully make you think, make you laugh, and have an enjoyable narrative experience. That's our kind of reason for making these things in the first place. The other thing that they all have in common is that they're all replayable. They're all games you can play more than once. So Pendragon is a roguelike. 80 Days is a bit like a board game. It's a kind of run-based game. Overboard is a time loop game. And Heaven's Vault is a 20-hour adventure game, but it's one that if you play it a second or a third time, you'll get a deeper and a richer story on those second and third and 20th playthroughs. And that's quite strange. Like, as a thing to aim for as a narrative studio, replayability is not an obvious target. So I wanted to talk today a bit about, bless you, a bit about why we made them replayable and how we made them replayable. And I'm going to talk about our games because obviously I know them. But I also want to talk about why I think narrative replayability is an interesting thing for us all to be thinking about as a medium. A couple of quick caveats up front. I'm talking about my experience writing my games within my context. I don't know your context, so you may need to translate what I'm saying into your context. If you work on God of War, you might not get as much value from this talk as if you work on a 5-person indie team. That's your problem, not my problem. So you keep that one to yourself. Cool. But to start talking about all this stuff, I want to start somewhere else, and I want to talk about Gene Wolfe. Gene Wolfe is my favorite writer. He's a science fiction writer. Has anyone read Gene Wolfe? Right, exactly. So the thing about Gene Wolfe is that he was prolific. He died a couple of years ago. He won pretty much every science fiction award there is to win out there multiple times. He's pretty obscure, though, especially in the UK. I feel like he's having a bit of a renaissance. I keep meeting people who are just discovering his work. But largely speaking, he kind of didn't hit the mainstream consciousness in the way that maybe Ursula Le Guin hit the mainstream consciousness, or, I don't know, Tolkien. And that's not hard to understand why, if you've read his books, because his books are really quite difficult to read in some ways. He's not a bad writer. In fact, he's a phenomenally good writer. But he doesn't really give a damn about explaining the story or the world to you as you're reading it. He's just not interested. You can keep up or you can fall off. He's very happy for either of those cases to go. He's not a kind of metaphorical, oh, it's all about the Vietnam War, Paul Auster kind of novelist. He writes very cleanly and very clearly. He just doesn't help you any more than he really feels you need to be helped. And I think that's really enjoyable. I really enjoy reading his books. But it's also really relevant to the kind of storytelling that games do, right? He has a strong core through line with a protagonist with a clear goal who you follow really generally quite closely, surrounded by an elliptical, hard to pin down, nebulous, ambiguous world that invites exploration. I feel like that should be a familiar model to you. It's what we see in From Software's games. It's been hugely popular for them. It's what we see in things like Journey and Shadow of the Colossus and Abzu. These are games that have held and compelled people with their mysterious kind of associatively put together worlds where you have to do the work yourself. Now, Wolfe, in an interview that I read when I was maybe in my 20s, when I was starting out as a writer and looking around for inspiration, delivered this wonderful quote about why he writes the way he does, which is this: if I'm going to spend all this time writing a book, you're damn well going to read it more than once. Which I really like. I love the energy behind it. It's so bullish. In fact, I loved it so much that when I started writing this talk, I wrote my entire talk around this quote. This was my centerpiece for the whole thing. And I finished it, and that was great. And then I thought I'd better just check that I'd got the words exactly right. So I Googled it and discovered that actually he never said this at all. Either I'd misremembered it or I'd made it up completely, but it didn't exist from him at all. So I did the only sensible thing to do in 2023, which is I went to ChatGPT and I asked it to back me up, which of course it did. So that was great. But then after that, I thought, well, this is a complete waste of time, so I'll do some proper research. And I went to Google, and in about 35 seconds, I managed to find what he actually said, which is this: my definition of good literature is that which can be read by an educated reader and reread with increased pleasure. Fair enough. That's a lot more Wolfian as a quote. It's got more nuance. It's got more bulk to it. He's saying quite a lot more with a very condensed number of words than how I actually misremembered it. Great. Wolfe also, before I move on to the actual talk, incidentally, is also the guy who invented Pringles. That's not actually true either, but but what is true is he invented a machine part that's used in the cooking process of Pringles, because he was an engineer, a mechanical engineer, before he became a writer. And I think the reason that the fake fact that he invented the whole thing has only stuck because Wolfe looked like this, and everyone assumed the thing that you guys just assumed, that he put his face on the box. Anyway, that's not enormously important. So back to my talk, as I originally wrote it. As the inventor of Pringles once said, if I'm going to spend all this time writing a book, you're damn well going to read it more than once. And since that quote is wrong, I'm going to take a leaf from the AI playbook, and I'm going to just change it to fit our context without any regard for reality. If I'm going to spend all this time writing a game, then you're damn well going to play it more than once. But as a call to action, that seems a bit redundant, right? Because games are replayable by default, aren't they? I mean, people do play Candy Crush more than once, even though it's always completely the same. People play FIFA really quite a lot. Rocket League is a box on the UK census as a religion. Games rely on loops, after all, and replay, restart is just another loop. So most games have got that one covered. But I think for those of us who make narrative games, or the narrative components of replayable games, the writers and the designers who do that, this might resonate a little bit more, because in general, narrative doesn't rely on loops. It relies on surprise and delight and setup and payoff and one-off special events and special cases. Narrative games, by default, can't be played and replayed. I think we probably have all experienced this and understand it. I don't need to dwell on it too much, but very quickly, here are a couple of examples just to demonstrate the problems. Because I mentioned AI a moment ago, one example is about piracy, and the other one is about something that goes on and on for far too long. So the first game of my pair is Return to Monkey Island, a joyfully written game, a wonderful adventure game, but I think it's very fair. I don't think it's controversial to say that it wasn't designed to be replayed. Adventure games generally suffer really badly on a replay because they just slow down a lot. Every clever puzzle becomes a shopping list, and God forbid you can't remember how to solve a puzzle, because then it's definitely your fault because you did know how to do it and now you don't. The pacing of an adventure game is very difficult on a second time round. That doesn't make it a bad game at all. It's just more of a quintessential, you play it once, you're done, you tell your friends, you move on sort of game. Meanwhile, at the other end of the scope spectrum, the story content in an Assassin's Creed game or any other big open world is not really there to be played and replayed. The story in a game like this is there to be consumed, to be completed, to be checked off, to go towards your percentage target. As narrative designers, I think we talk about giving the player some story, and the player talks about getting some story. So that is to say that in most of these bigger games, the narrative design player relationship is basically this. And I've illustrated the content as Pringles because each Pringle is a tasty, perfectly formed, exactly identically shaped nugget of pure content with just enough carbohydrate to satisfy your bite, but not enough, God forbid, to ever actually fill you up. But I should really have illustrated the player down here as a completely different miserable Victorian child, because from the narrative player's point of view, a game like this is a content mine. The player is a miner. They go down into the world of the game. They chip away at the world using the mechanics of the game. Nobody's listening. Look, you have to pay attention. There's a pun coming up. So the player is a miner chipping away at the world to extract little nuggets of lore, there we go, which they can carry up to the surface to exchange in Discord forums as a kind of social currency. That's why people play these games, right? And obviously, any mine is finite. There is no such thing as sustainable mining, despite the fact that mining companies are trying to do that right now. So even though big games are very loot-based and they're quite good at repeating their mechanics over and over and over, compared to, say, adventure games, they still run dry in the end. There is a limit to how much content they can generate. Obviously, we've recently seen people suggesting that we employ AI or some equivalent to endlessly restock the mine by hosing meaningless nonsense into it. But if the lore that you're gathering doesn't connect to or assonate with or inflect on the other lore in the game, you can't theorize about it with yourself or with your friends. So it's literally worthless. If you fill your diamond mine with sludge, it won't give you more diamonds. It'll give you a mine full of sludge. So let's ignore that because it's stupid. So the problem we really have is that as writers, as designers and as writers, we're limited by the constraints of games. I mean, of course we are. That's not a bad thing or a controversial thing. We can't not be limited by the constraints of games. If you're writing theatrical plays, you can't crash a helicopter into the stage. That's the limit of theatre. Fine. I think, though, games are really very limited in the kinds of narrative content we're allowed to deliver, and this is something that we struggle with. There are, in fact, by my reckoning, only 2 forms that narrative content is permitted to take in games. You can call them by different names, but I've gone for the justification and backstory. These won't be unfamiliar to you. So justification is the intros and the cutscenes and the scenarios and the setup that tells you what you're going to do. Obviously, a talented writer will inject a bit of character where they can, and that's great, but it's still pretty functional stuff. In screenwriting, they call this exposition. I've called it justification because in games, it has a tendency to be quite flimsy, actually. But in film, it's called exposition. And it's generally considered to be very hard work, as anyone who's sat through Tenet can attest to. To quote the Hollywood script guru Robert McKee, if exposition is a scene's sole justification, a disciplined writer will trash it. I'm not really a McKee groupie. He's a little bit too tub-thumping and formulaic for my taste, but I do think this description applies to quite a large amount of games writing. And indeed, games are often so busy doing this kind of justification that we kind of forget that it's not actually very interesting. And then we get all surprised and a little bit hurt when the player can't actually remember what it is that they're supposed to be doing, despite having sat through half an hour of Norman Reedus telling them while wearing sunglasses. So that's that. And then secondly, we have backstory. The rules of backstory are super simple. You all know them. I don't need to go through them. Practically speaking, backstory is that kind of narrative where writers are allowed to write whatever they like. They can go crazy. They can write anything, so long as it's understood that players are 100% free to walk straight past it without caring, which, of course, players do. They do ignore audio logs. They do ignore the written content in the world. And they increasingly do that as they play the game for a while, and they start to understand that it's not helping them to get through the game. And it really doesn't help on replay, because on replay, players ignore them completely, because either they have learned that they don't care, or they've seen it before, and neither of those is really a win. The curious thing about this kind of lore pickup model that we have in games, which is very effective and does deliver content to the people who choose to read it, is that it's quite unique to games. I can't really think of any equivalent in film. Like a flashback in a film is actually just core narrative that happens to have happened before. There is something in books which is similar. It's these things, which are the little pull quotes at the start of chapters. So the one on the left is from Dune, and the one on the right is from our novelization of Heaven's Vault that we did over lockdown, because we were going mad. And I quite like them. They're quite fun. But we had to use them to novelize Heaven's Vault because we had all this world building that was in the game that we wanted to put in the book that didn't fit in the narrative anywhere. We couldn't just have somebody say, oh, I'm just going to take half a page to read a piece of text to you that I found in this library, because we're not Umberto Eco, so we couldn't get away with that kind of thing. But this was a good solution, and it is there in books. They have been doing it for a while, so it's not like we invented the lore concept. It's also worth noting, before we move on, that some games do put critical information into their collectible narrative. So, for example, in Outer Wilds, you really do have to read every single one of these squiggly lines if you're going to get through the game. I think on balance, it still counts as backstory because it's not narrative that's happening to you right now. And it doesn't help much with replay because if you know, and then you know. So you're not going to replay it particularly. All of which sounds like what I'm saying with my one keynote that I'm ever going to be allowed to give is that the secret to replayable narratives is to make them as skippable as possible. And there's some truth in that. The single play game that I've played the most times over is Shadow of the Colossus, because I kept having to buy the remasters because my consoles kept dying. And that one has completely skippable narrative because it doesn't really have a narrative. It's just got world-building vibes, which is a bit like saying that you enjoy the art on Magic the Gathering cards when you're playing Magic the Gathering, which is totally valid, but it's not really anything to do with story per se. But then I thought, well, maybe replayability is just a matter of having good writing. Like maybe just like everything else in the world, it's the writer's fault and we should just get better at writing and go away until we've learned our craft properly. Except there's lots of really awesome writing in games these days, and it hasn't magically solved the problem of making games richer and deeper on replay. And I don't think it will, because good writing is like a good art style. It's important, but it's a medium for the expression of something else. And while games are getting better narratives all the time, I still feel like we're kind of afraid of the raw power of storytelling. Like in the games industry, don't we like to keep writers at arm's length? We sort of box them away into Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel, and we don't really like them to get into source control if at all possible. And we definitely don't want them to get into the code, and God forbid they actually learn to code. And let's make sure our writers don't play the game. And when they talk about their writing, they say, oh, no, I've never played Call of Duty. I've written 5 of them, but I wouldn't play them. I don't know who wrote Call of Duty, and I don't know if that's true. I imagine, I used to work in AAA, but it was a while ago, and things are changing. But meetings between writers and designers must be a bit like when I go with my kids to a restaurant that's more expensive than I thought it was going to be. And they sort of say, oh, Dad, I'd really like a quiet, emotional moment now. And I say, oh, honey, I'd really like to buy you a quiet emotional moment, but it's going to interrupt the player's flow, so I don't think we can. And they say, oh, well, maybe I could have a political theme. And I say, oh, yeah, I bet you could do 10 political themes. You'd be amazing, but we've got to be neutral. So no. Or we might say, oh, how about at least can I show the protagonist vulnerability just a little bit? And you say, oh, well, that would be really great, but the protagonist is going to have to shoot 25 people in the face really soon, and it's already past bedtime. So as a writer and a designer at Inkle, because we're small, I basically sit on my swivel chair doing Gollum and Smeagol and having this argument with myself. And more seriously, we look at the writers' strike in US television that's going on at the moment, and we think, in all honesty, we think, solidarity to those people. But that won't ever happen in our industry, because in our industry, writers don't get residuals. And the reason they don't get residuals is because they know their place. And if they don't know their place, we're going to replace them with AI. From a creative point of view, these feel like dark times to me. But I would like to stress, I do think there are going to be better times ahead, because everyone who banks on AI content is going to lose. You cannot build real estate in a swamp. When I was last at Develop, all the monkey people were out in force trying to sell us on cryptocurrency. They're not here anymore. We still are. Ultimately, no investment bubble can survive a complete apathy of demand. Nobody wants AI content, which is not surprising because it is as compelling as a wet omelette. So for me, the real question is actually, given that we already know that storytelling can be transcendental, can be compelling, can be wonderful. We have proved this to ourselves as a species for 1,000,000 years. It's not up for debate. How do we as game writers tell great stories anyway, despite the constraints that we have, ideally without anyone noticing until it's too late to stop us? And that takes me back to Wolfe and what he really said, which was this: my definition of good literature is that which can be read by an educated reader and reread with increased pleasure. And the question that we should be asking, when ChatGPT tried to justify my false quote, it said it was describing the levels of nuance in his work. Is this Wolfe describing the levels of nuance in his work? I posit that it's not. I think the question that he's answering is, if you're a good writer, why the hell are you wasting your time on science fiction? And Wolfe is replying, my definition of good literature is not a genre, it's that which can be read by an educated reader, hence the barb in an educated reader,
That's an F-off, if anything was. And reread with increased pleasure. He's saying that literature is a quality of fiction, not a genre of fiction. The fact that it's about spaceships and robots is entirely orthogonal to whether it's actually literature. It doesn't have to be about relationships and Kent in the 1970s to be literature. And the reason he's saying this so acidly is because as a science fiction writer, you probably spend your whole life trying to justify why you're not writing proper books. Does that resonate for game writers out there? It certainly does for me, because we game writers, we aren't proper writers. We get added to the awards as a kind of afterthought, the writing awards. I've won the Writers Guild of Great Britain award for games writing. And I remember going to the drinks afterwards and being met by a lovely old gentleman who said, "Congratulations on your award. I've never played your game. I never will. I don't understand how you can do what you do. I just write films." And I thought, I'm not a fucking alien. Like this is the same craft, but that's the position that we find ourselves in. Games are either stupid or they're just dangerous. There's no middle ground. Games get blamed for riots in France, not, you know, Les Miserables. Like France is a country with a proud 300-year history of rioting, but no, it's all the fault of Bobble Bobble. So I think what Wolfe is reminding us is that it's always possible to go deeper. It's always possible to make something which has more to it than it first appears. Something which is entertaining, sure, but is not simply entertaining. Something which can be reread with increased pleasure, not diminished and compromised pleasure. That's the challenge that he's throwing down for science fiction writers, and I think that's also the challenge that he's throwing down for us. And that's why I think we should make our narratives hold up second time around, even though it hurts. And to think about how we can do that, I want to go back to looking at some other storytelling forms that have solved this replay problem a million times over already. And by that, I don't necessarily mean looking at anything particularly pretentious or intellectual. Here, for example, are the 3 movies that I've rewatched the most time in my life. The first is Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. The second is Blade Runner. And the third is The Muppet Treasure Island. I'm a kid of the 90s. I know pretty much every line of every scene of these films, but I'm very happy to watch them again whenever the opportunity arises. It's definitely not because I'm piecing together a complex puzzle plot within an elliptical, unknowable world. There are some pretty major reveals in The Muppet Treasure Island, but by the end of it, by the time the credits roll, it's pretty much all wrapped up. And while Blade Runner has a little bit more of an elliptical world around it, it is still a story about a policeman who shoots some robots. He doesn't even retire a human by mistake. None of these films are about plot. And the truth is that plot is exactly what doesn't matter on a repeat viewing. You know the plot. It's over. There's nothing left to understand. A couple of years ago, there was a little spate of time loop games, I think Overboard included, which really proved this for games. Anyway, once you've completed Outer Wilds, you've solved it. You've turned all the things you didn't understand into things which you do understand. The game is done. You can't go back to not knowing, and there's nowhere forward to go. By contrast, a game like Journey, how many people have played Journey? How many people have played it more than once? Quite a lot, I would say. And Journey contains no narrative solutions whatsoever, and as such, can be played as often as you like. You can always go back to it because you can't solve it. And I think that's the problem with the 2 narrative modes that I mentioned earlier, this justification and backstory modes, because they're both modes of understanding. They let me understand what I'm supposed to be doing, or what my options are, or who my character is, or why the world is built the way that it's built. But it's all cognitive. That's why game writers are allowed them, because we had to go in the past to designers and programmers and say, can we please put some writing in the game? And they say, what's it for? And we say, oh, it helps the player understand what they're doing. And because designers are mostly worried about whether the player understands what they're doing or not, they say, oh, okay, if it helps, you're allowed it. The problem with the question of does the player understand the story, though, is the player might say, yep, as you do at the end of Outer Wilds, as you do at the end of Overboard. And then the narrative is spent, and so is the game. And you can't reset your understanding of something. You just can't do that. So we can make some progress here by making our stories more elliptical or more ambiguous, and starting arguments and then running away before we finish them, and making sure that no one can actually piece together a coherent plot because we've embedded contradictions into the game world itself. And I think Journey does this, and Heaven's Vault definitely does this, because I remember doing it deliberately. And it's very compelling, but it does come with a risk, which is at some point, most players, perhaps not all players, will say, will say this and say, well, it just doesn't make sense. It's all just vibes. I'm wasting my time here, and go off in frustration. I mean, you can work to prevent that by making sure that you, the writer, do know what the answer is, and you're not just making up things that look cool. Whether Joni did that or not is an open question, I think. But it's still a risk. And also, it's massively over-engineered. Not every game needs to be an ambiguous, mysterious world of unknowable truths to be interesting. Sometimes you just want to entertain people. So, for example, and to demonstrate where I think we should go, here is a clip from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, which I think really hammers home the point I want to make. And with a bit of luck, the audio will work too.
Gentlemen, I'm here to help you with your history report.
What? How? Oh, I hate that part. Bill, what? Strange things are afoot at the Circle K.
Now, your laughter has proved my point that I was about to make. The important critical thing about this clip is not the time loop caused by the arrival of the future Bill and future Ted in the other phone booth. The vitally important thing about this clip, the heart and soul of the entire movie, is this. It's Keanu Reeves. It's the one film where Reeves is truly perfectly cast. He's not sexy or slick. He's just very, very nice and perhaps a little bit dim. We're not watching Bill and Ted for the time travel twists. We're watching it for this guy's reaction to the time travel twists. Because films are built almost entirely out of reaction shots. That's what great film actors and actresses are really good at. They sit around, somebody turns the camera on, they pull a face, they hold it, they don't necessarily even say that much. There isn't that much dialogue in most films. They cut and then they move on, and it's just the right face for just the right moment. I once had the honor of working on a film set with Keira Knightley for a day, and she's very, very good at this. It's really startling to watch an actress of her caliber do that, because it just appears and disappears, and you go, wow, do you practice in front of a mirror? And presumably she does. Marvel, to take the other end of the acting spectrum, has a reputation for great action sequences, or did for the last decade anyway. And it's not because of their computer-generated models bashing each other in interesting ways. You can do that with plastic action figures. You don't need Marvel for that. Why they work is because they're infused with character. We're there to see Iron Man pissing off Captain America in the middle of a fight with some aliens, just as 30 years ago we went to see Leia and Han bickering in the middle of a blaster fight. It's the same idea. It's the character that makes the action worth watching. When we rewatch a movie, it's the reactions that we're watching, because they give us the sense of connection. They give us the sense of being there in that world, in that moment. It's these moments. It's Keanu Reeves being a wide-eyed idiot that is what the whole of storytelling actually is really about. Everything else is just a vehicle for those moments. This is actually the fundamental truth. When I'm rewatching Blade Runner, I am not wondering what happened to the sixth replicant who's mentioned early on and then forgotten about due to a continuity error. Nor am I following the clues with the detective, because I know where they go. I'm in that world, breathing the smoke, walking the streets, soaking up the atmosphere. When I'm rewatching or rereading The Lord of the Rings, I'm going to Middle-earth, but not from the top-down perspective of a map, but from the head height of a hobbit, from the ground up. That's why the story exists. It's to let me do that. When I rewatch The Muppet Treasure Island, I'm basically just hanging out with the Muppets, which is great. And the story is there just to let me do that. That's all it's for. So how do we take this back to games? Well, of course, we already have. Game writers have been doing this for ages, actually, using the third top secret, but accidentally sanctioned form of dialogue, which is not considered to be proper storytelling, but clever game writers notice that actually it is, and that's banter, or barks, right? Barks are the reaction comments that respond to gameplay triggers. So they start off as just literally someone saying, oof, as a sound effect in Street Fighter. Then they go to, there's a grenade when there's a grenade, and so on and so on. But increasingly, game writers are leveraging them to create the heart and soul moments that actually make the game sing. So, for example, the stories that get told while you're riding your boat around in God of War are powered by a bark system. The droid banter in Jedi Survivor that brings those robot characters to life is powered by a bark system. The background chit-chat that is the entirety of the Guardians of the Galaxy game. The bickering of Drake and Elena during firefights in Uncharted. Those are the bits of writing which are dynamic and characterful and highly memorable in a way that realistically cutscenes and lore pickups, generally speaking, just aren't. And that's not accidental. That's because banter is an incredible form of storytelling within our medium. I tried to list all the things that are good about it, right? Banter it's embedded into what the player is doing. You're not stopping to watch a cutscene or reading a diary page. You're actually within the action that you were taking in the first place. Banter is characterful, obviously, because it comes from characters. Banter is plentiful. There's loads of it. So if you want to waste a beat on a reaction shot or an aside or a callback or a joke or a highly specific reference that only 5% of players will see, you can afford to do that, which you can't do with cutscenes because they're just too expensive and too complicated to build. Banter is contextual. We respond to the current gameplay situation, right? That's what a bark does, but we can also respond to anything else that the game knows, like what's the player's current progress through the story? What quest are they thinking about right now? Why are they in this particular firefight as opposed to that one and that one? Who was the guy with the grenade? Was it the guy with the funny hat? We can reference that specifically if we want to. In Heaven's Vault, we use a knowledge model to track everything the players learned and hypothesized about this ancient civilization they're exploring, and that informs the dialogue that gets chosen between the two characters. So the protagonist is this kind of context filter on the world, which is great for replay because it means, in effect, if you play the story in a different order, she'll say completely different things. And that's all coming out of a really basic bark system, actually, but it powers a 20-hour game on multiple replays. Banter is also reactive. It can be disjointed if it wants to. So in Pendragon, which is our least successful game commercially by some margin, but was a really important experiment for me as a sort of semi-codey writer person, that the way it works is the characters talk to each other as they move across this chess-like board. And if there's nothing going on, they'll reminisce and they'll share moments between themselves. But then if something happens and they're plunged into battle, they can react immediately to what's happening by just binning the previous conversation because there's no requirement to get to the end of it and talk about what's happening instead. So if Guinevere is suddenly threatened, Morgana Le Fay will burst into laughter, she's a baddie, and Lancelot will declare how he's going to avenge her, and that's great. Banter can just do this. It's a natural part of the system. Finally, banter demands good pacing. The whole of the banter system, all the code behind it, relies on getting it to appear at the right time and not the wrong time. You don't want somebody to start telling you an anecdote as they're falling off a cliff. So it forces you to think about pacing, which is very good from a storytelling point of view. And I think that last point is actually really key because banter is about synchronizing the narrative and the play via synchronizing the player and the protagonist. So we have this idea at Inkle, which we kind of had from the beginning, though I don't know how we happened on it. We certainly weren't being like insightful. It just seemed like a good idea at the time, which is that the player does what the protagonist does and the protagonist does what the player does, which sounds bloody obvious until you stop to notice how often this rule gets broken in the normal course of things. So, for example, if you're Aloy and you're running around the world of Horizon and you're shooting robot dinosaurs with your homemade tin bow and arrow, that's completely fine. But she's also stripping and whittling every single sapling that she passes. Okay, well, clearly that's something the player is doing. They're collecting ammunition pickups. But it's not something that Aloy is really doing. Similarly, Geralt, the noble witcher, does not actually go into the cottage of every peasant in these poor wildernesses and raid their house for all the gold they've got. You know that he doesn't, because if you made a TV version of it, that's like the first thing you'd cut and you'd never even notice it was gone, which they did, and you didn't. And it's not a criticism of those games. They do know what they're doing and why. They're perfectly well designed, but you can imagine the situation of a writer who's given the job of providing a dialogue bark for those situations. You know, does Geralt swipe a few gold pieces from a peasant and say ka-ching? Does Aloy strip a tree for arrows and go, oh, that's a lovely straight one, that'll fly really nicely? No, of course not. There's nothing you can say in those situations that isn't ridiculous. So they very sensibly say bing or pink or clink, because that's the only thing you can get away with. Note that in the other direction, what is grief but love persevering? What is a cutscene except the protagonist that we're supposed to be embodying doing something really cool that the player doesn't get to do? That is literally what a cutscene is. My biggest complaint with the Uncharted series was always that all the flirting happens in the bits where I don't get to do anything. And that just seems cruel and unfair. So note that if we have this idea that the player and the protagonist are kind of synced up, it doesn't mean that the player has to do what the protagonist is doing in detail. We don't need to go all Red Dead Redemption skinning horses on us. If you're crafting arrows, you don't need to move the stick to whittle the wood down. It's really just that the timing and the frequency of the arrow-making activity needs to make narrative sense within the world. So you shouldn't be crafting arrows in the middle of a battle, but it's still okay to hit a button to reload a clip in the middle of a battle, because one of them makes narrative sense and the other one doesn't. And it doesn't preclude more dramatic storytelling things like hard cuts and time jumps. You know, if you're watching an action thriller and the rock gets into a car and then it cuts and then the rock gets into an aeroplane, that cut isn't there because the protagonist did something that the viewer didn't need to see. That cut is there because the rock does not get stuck in traffic for an hour. That just doesn't happen to the rock. Same as he doesn't go to the toilet, he doesn't do the washing up, and he doesn't hydrate ever. He just pours bottles of water over his head like the fountain in a Chinese restaurant. So at Inkle, we have this idea to try and make games as much as we possibly can entirely out of banter. So that means no cutscenes or vanishingly few, no audio logs, just enough relevant in the moment storytelling nuggets that the story somehow gets told. And that means that the gameplay has to be there to facilitate the banter, not the banter to facilitate the gameplay, but the other way around. So another way of putting that is to say that all of our games are fundamentally argument simulators. So in 80 days, if you know it, you go around the world in 80 days, you're challenged to travel around the world so that Passepartout and Fogg can piss each other off in the desert. That's why you do it. That's the point of the game. In Heaven's Vault, you explore an ancient 4,000-year-old civilization so that the pedantic robot and the grumpy scientist can annoy each other in the desert. In Overboard, you're covering up a murder so that you can tie yourself in a knot trying to keep all your lies straight. That's the whole joy of these games. That's why they're fun to play, if they're fun to play. Obviously, the design doesn't have to be arguments either. Like, I'd love to play a romantic game that worked like this, because what is a romance story apart from two people arguing with each other all the time, except we know they like each other, really. So this banter player-protagonist thing, it's definitely possible, because I think we've done it. Lots of games have probably done it. I'm just going to talk about the ones that I know well, because I happen to build them. But you do have to be ruthless, right? You've got to actually be ruthless with your design. So, for example, in 80 days, which is sort of RPG-ish, there are no experience points to spend. And that's because skill trees do not map to any real-world experience that we can describe via dialogue. Passepartout can't say, hold on a sec there, Mr. Fogg, I'm just growing a new part of my brain. I'll be back in a moment. But you do have to pack your suitcase. You do it through quite an abstract interface of dragging boxes into boxes. You can't sit on the suitcase to squash a little bit more in. But it does mean that if you throw out one of Fogg's pieces of clothing to make room for a nice, tasty, bejeweled scimitar that you can sell for a profit later on, Fogg can pop up and say, Passepartout, where's my hat? In Heaven's Vault, Aaliyah translates things by choosing words from a draggable menu into quite an abstract interface that looks like something from a sort of mobile title. It's got that kind of vibe to it. And then she and Six will talk about the answer she's produced. But the fact that they can talk about it and reference the translation you've made specifically is what makes this otherwise very abstract thing feel like you really are translating something. We get away with it that way. In our next game, A Highland Song, which is a sort of platformer with rhythm elements, the protagonist is a teenager trekking across the Scottish Highlands, and it's taken us ages, like ages, to whittle down the mechanics from the abstractions of platformers to something that's grounded enough that it makes narrative sense. So Moira can jump, and she can jump slightly higher than a real person too, but bunny hopping isn't a better and more efficient way to get through the level than just running. And there are no health pickups, but Moira can sit down and rest if she wants to heal. And if she rests under shelter and out of the rain, she'll heal better than if she sits in the middle of the rain. And at night, she needs to sleep. And again, shelters are better than open ground. And to navigate the world, there's no top-down mini-map thing. Instead, you climb up a mountain to get a better view so that you can orientate a paper map which shows you where to go next, and so on and so on. And all of these moments we can narrate as they happen in a reactive, joyful, characterful way because they make sense. We're not trying to justify something ludicrous. That's really helpful from a narrative point of view. And it doesn't matter that the game is 2.5D and it has limited animation and no mocap, because we don't actually need visual realism for a narrative to feel grounded at all. We need a realism of activity. We need that synchronization between player and protagonist. But while I clearly think banter is a fantastic system for storytelling, and I think it can ground our more abstract mechanics in the narrative reality of our games, it does not entirely solve our replay problem. because there is a big problem that we do need to tackle, which is just straight up repetition. Our brains are really good at spotting repeats, not just repeats, but also pattern repeats. And when we see them, our brains tend to use that as an excuse to stop paying attention and to think about something else. To give you a quick demonstration of how good our brains are at that, here is a quick story written by everyone's favorite worst piece of software ever, ChatGPT. So take a moment to look over it. I should add, this is not a cherry-picked example. This is the first thing I typed in. I screen grabbed the first response and I put it in the slide. This is absolutely 100% not rigged. Okay, it's basically impossible to read, right? I don't know if everybody would concur with that. I certainly find it very hard to read. Like a lot of AI writing, it's like it's got butter on it. My eyes just kind of slide off the middle of it. About halfway down, I'm not actually paying attention to the content anymore. I'm thinking about how hungry I am, or that slight pain I've got in my foot, or what I need to do in an hour's time. I cannot concentrate on it. And it's not because I've got ADHD, because actually I don't. It's for a really good reason, which is if you take the output, that's the same output copy-pasted, and you break it up line by line and you mark it up a bit, it's because every single sentence is constructed in precisely the same way as every other sentence. Okay, it doesn't repeat word for word, but it repeats structure for structure, and it has to because it's dumb, and all it's done is average all writing and ended up with that is the canonical form that English takes in a narrative context. So I'm going to just keep doing it. And there are people out there trying to produce novels of this stuff. Like, holy crap, how could you misunderstand writing even more? Like, it's pathetic. Like, if my son, who is 7, handed this in to his English teacher, my English teacher would call me up and say, is everything okay at home? But it's a subtle kind of repetition. It's quite a profound kind of repetition in that it's quite hard to notice that's what's happening until you actually colorize it. But it's extremely off-putting for our actual brains we actually live in. It's a bit like the textual equivalent of that middle distance vacant stare that all middle journey character art has. You look at it and you know there's something off about it, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is, unless you're an artist, in which case you can tell me immediately it's because it's got bugger all character. And that's the whole point of drawing a character, right? Unfortunately, games are also machines. They're also algorithmic, and they are super repetitive in exactly this pattern matching way because that's how they're made. So one of the core jobs of the level designer is to wring the maximum amount of variation out of the given mechanics using as much of their human ingenuity as they can muster. The weekend, I was playing Lemmings in a computer museum, which made me feel very old. And Lemmings, if you know it, is a great example of this in that it has a very limited palette. And it does absolutely every single variation of its content that it can possibly get away with. There are levels that start with lemmings mid-death fall, so you have to catch them in mid-air. There's levels with only 1 lemming to save. There's levels with 1,000 lemmings where you only have to save 1 of them. There's levels where you have to break the mechanics themselves by exploiting pixel deficiencies in their detection system to get underneath bridges. It's really very, very ingenious, and it is so because a team of designers built the game and then just threw levels at each other for a year and then shipped it. It's kind of the canonical example for me of how far level design can take a basic concept, given the right circumstances. But the problem is, all of that is still very cognitive stuff. Level design that's balanced to give you a great first playthrough is very hard to rebalance for a second or a third game. You know, maybe you add a new game plus mode, but that just makes the game harder, which slows everything down, even though the player's already seen the game before. So maybe you add a god mode, which means the player can get through things faster, but then maybe that makes your game feel trivial and not worth playing. Or maybe you fill it with branching alternatives, so the player can mine all those branching alternatives, but is that an attractive value proposition for a player, or is that a waste of their time? All of this stuff really is it's just a way of saying that repetition is a game design problem. No amount of good writing is going to fix that. And the solutions will be specific to the game that you're making. So to whip through some solutions that we took, in 80 days, we have quite limited options for where you can go on your first playthrough of the game. On further loops of the game, we open up new destinations on the Orient Express. So you can basically skip the entire of Europe and get to a choice point faster. That wasn't hard to do. That was really cheap because we accidentally wrote too much content in the first place. So we just turned some stuff on and then very generously turned some stuff off and then generously turned it back on again later. And everyone said, oh, this is amazing, it's expanding. And we're going, no, we just buggered the balancing when we built it. That's entirely different. Branching narrative is actually really good for that because generally a first-time player is already overwhelmed, so doesn't need as much variation as you might think they do. In Overboard, you can't really do that because you're playing through a day, so you quite often have to repeat a scene. So we just implemented a fast-forward system like they have in visual novels. It's fairly smart and can handle branching context quite well, but it just means if there's a scene you've played, you can just bust through it. and it's relatively satisfying to do, and it has a nice sound effect. In Heaven's Vault, we have a very sophisticated solution. So when you're translating language puzzles, they're constructed procedurally from a dictionary of words and a bank of phrases. And at the moment you get a translation, the game triangulates the best phrase that will make sense here from your current knowledge base so that you've got enough challenge, but not so much challenge, you just can't understand what's going on. We do that in every language puzzle in the entire game anyway. So New Game Plus was easy. We just didn't delete your dictionary. And then when the game starts, it's still picking harder and harder examples. You just happen to be finding them in the places where you previously found simpler ones. So we got that for free, actually. In Highland, it's a little bit more complicated because one of our core mechanics is finding maps that open up new paths. So we make those paths persistent from one game to the next. That's good, I think, because it means that as the player kind of gets out of the nitty-gritty of the basic gameplay into trying to understand the wider construction of the world, they can get to the wider places of the world more efficiently and open it up and kind of expand their play space and get better at the game through opening all these shortcuts. That's a little bit more expensive to build because every map is hand-drawn, but ultimately we just find a cool-looking place in the world, stick a map pointing to it, and make sure there's something there. It's relatively quick. So I think the one thing I would say is that if you're trying to solve the repetition game design problem, you need to find things which are efficient for you to build and do. And that's probably the biggest problem. But that's OK. It's not a writer's problem, so the designers can just deal with that. What I thought was interesting about this, though, was in all of those cases, you have essentially a really large bank of gameplay, much bigger than we expect any player to see the entirety of. And we kind of draw it down into the game loop every time you play. We just pull the next bit along, which is to say that despite the fact that gameplay is built on loops and narrative is this progression that can't go backwards, over the course of multiple replays, that actually reverses completely because skill is a linear progression that can't go backwards. You can't not understand Outer Wild once you've understood Outer Wild. You can't get worse at Elden Ring combat once you've figured out how to do Elden Ring combat. But narrative we can enjoy over and over again in the way that I watch Bill and Ted over and over again. I can enjoy narrative content repeatedly because of the connection. I can't do the same Sudoku twice. So I think that explains for me why the one replayable game, or sorry, the one game we have which is not replayable is Overboard, which is a time loop game. And you would have thought, oh, replayable narratives, that is time loop games. But it isn't. A time loop game is a single linear experience that happens to reuse assets in a clever way. That's what it really is. In every Star Trek time loop episode, it's a beginning, middle, and an end that just happens to happen over the same few hours. So the reason we couldn't make Overboard have a true from the beginning again replay is because the story is the gameplay. We haven't got a bank of gameplay that progresses and can be expanded. And we can't add anything to the story because it's horrendously complicated. And that's OK. That's fine. That's not a great loss. You can't really read Agatha Christie books again when you know whodunit because she's not the greatest writer in the world, actually. And once you know whodunit, most of the puzzle and the joy is gone. And that's fine. Not every book has to be literature. Not every game has to be literature. And Overboard is definitely pulp. And even for the games we make which are replayable, even for the ones that we're proud of their replayability or excited about the depth that they can offer, I think it's still worth underlining the last point I want to make, which is that this is not a call for infinite games. As a narrative person, I'm not interested in compulsion loops. I'm not interested in attention sinks. Those are all things which make people turn their brains off. And the point of narrative is to turn your brain on. And the point at which you stop paying attention is the point at which, frankly, I don't want to have you as my audience anymore. Please go away and wake yourself up and do something else. So if you've fallen asleep during this talk, you can leave. But what I do want is, as Wolfe says, I want games that you can replay with increased pleasure. So, that's kind of the goal. When we made 80 Days, we actually thought that people would play it once, restart it, play a couple of cities, go, oh, I get it, it branches, and then never come back to it. Some people do that. Some people play it a lot. Some people have played it 20 or 100 times. We're fine with all of those. All of those are good, so long as people are ending because they're satisfied, not because they're bored. That seems to me to be a win. So to summarize everything that I've said, and thank you very much for all your attention, I don't think we're aiming for this. I think sometimes we think that we are. I think what we're really aiming for and what we can definitely achieve because we are good enough and we do have the tools that we require is this. Thank you very much. believe I have got time for questions. So if anybody would like to ask a question, please put your hand up, and someone with a microphone will come and find you and make you wish you hadn't put your hand up. Yes.
Hey. Wow, that was loud. Sorry. Have you played the Dishonored games? I think they're very good for replayability.
So I haven't played the Dishonored game because mostly first-person games make me feel extremely sick, which is a really limiting factor as a game designer. So that's unfortunate. I had a feeling when I did this talk that everyone would come up to me afterwards and say, yeah, nice idea, but what about this replayable game that I really like? And I think everyone probably has the games that they love that they replayed a lot, and whether they fit with this analysis or not, I genuinely don't know. I'd be interested. I think it's quite a huge topic. So I'm kind of tempted to say, if you can summarize it, why? Why is Dishonored a good category for replay for you?
You can play it either like killing everyone or not killing anyone, and the universe changes and the internal dialogue of the characters change. Okay, so the game's been designed to be approached in lots of different ways. So you get that design solution to the repetition, and then the narrative reflects that, which makes you feel like you've done something cool. Yeah.
And enjoyable. That sounds great. Doesn't that sound great? Brilliant. Fantastic. It's more of a comment than a question, maybe. But,
well, I guess.
Does anyone else have any questions? No, I'm not even going to choose. Yeah.
Hi. So the games I really like are the games where I can explore the world a lot. And I was wondering if you could maybe place this like mechanic or like way of seducing the player, making the world like big and you know, like the shortcuts in the game that you made. How would you describe it as like a narrative or like mechanic aspect? Which one out of the one that you listed would it be?
I think so. The question is about kind of marrying exploration in games to this idea. I think there's one fundamental question at the heart of that, which is how important is the narrative, or how important is the beginning, middle, and end part of your narrative? Because I think a lot of the games that I've been describing are games which do try to tell you a story that starts, ends, and then if you want to play it again, that's great. So you could imagine an explorable game where the map gets literally bigger every time you play. There's just more places to explore as you do whatever this storyline is. And some people might go, oh, that's interesting. And some people might say, that's really weird. Why don't we just carry on exploring? And I think the argument to not make a game which is just huge and you just explore and explore and explore is that at some point the narrative will run out of momentum. Like, okay, I'm now going off into this forest over here because I saw a cool looking thing, and the narrative is going, okay, fine, anytime you want to get back to the actual plot line, it'll be waiting for you, and all the people who said, oh, my village is on fire and it's really serious will still be there, and their village will still be on fire. And if you come back 14 weeks later with a suntan, they'll say, it's so good that you came. They won't say, oh my God, you're the worst hero ever. And you can sell that, and plenty of games get away with that, and we just suspend our disbelief over that particular hump in the road. Fine, not a problem. For my personal interests, I think something like 80 days and the way that it expands itself over time would be the way that I would approach it, because I care about that narrative consistency a lot. But whether that's applicable to all games, like I say, it's a problem for you rather than for me, I think. Any other questions? I've got a few minutes.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. This was awesome. It was very fun in a I want to cry now kind of way. So my question is, you mentioned about banter, that it has to be sort of pacing, the pacing has to be very tight. What are the challenges? And when you write a game entirely out of banter, what are the challenges in making sure that it all sort of flows nicely for the player? How do you deal with the challenges? How do you deal with the edge cases of things that don't quite articulate properly? How does that work for you?
It is definitely very difficult. So the question is, how do you make your banter kind of slot? How do you pace it nicely into the game? So unfortunately, a banter system is basically a procedural generation system ultimately, or a procedural delivery system. And they are always really hard to get right. So you'll kind of pace it out, and then suddenly your dialogue's too frequent, so you slow it down, and then it's too scarce, and then it fires during this particular context that's wrong. I was talking to a narrative designer on a large AAA game who was saying that their banter system kept running into problems because it would detect whether you were close to an enemy encounter so that it would avoid them, but it kept detecting that vertically as well. So there were entire levels where, because there was a boss at the top of a mountain, no one ever said anything. And like that kind of problem, there will be a long list of those problems, and they can be very hard. So in something like Pendragon, I think one of the reasons why that game, I like it, but I don't think it works as well as it could. And I think part of the reason is there's just so many things that can happen on any given turn that the banter system occasionally just falls over and doesn't do as good a job as it could. Still, when it works, it's delightful. I think I'm very proud of the dialogue system in Heaven's Vault, because that really does sustain 20 hours of gameplay, and there isn't really a single scripted conversation there. There are elements in the world you can interact with, but everything else is feeding through this one system, and it just manages to feel about right to me. So it's just the common things of testing, trying to understand the edge cases, trying to code around them. I think it helps if you have narrative designers who are actually code proficient, because they can find problems, debug them, and solve them. And I think if you have a wall between your narrative design and your coders, I don't think it's possible. But that feels to me like a sign that it's an interesting thing to be doing rather than anything else. So very specific to solve, I think. But yes, definitely a problem. I think I maybe have time for one more.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm wondering if you can help me with a specific design problem, because I'm currently, our team is
no pressure.
designing such a banter system. And one of the things that we've come up against is this question of repetition and defining at what point a banter entry is considered to be played. Because obviously, if we get halfway through a banter, there might be a really lovely nugget of a line at the end that we kind of want to replay. But is that going to throw the player because they've already heard the first half if we restart it again? And then you end up doing the naughty dog thing and having those like interruption systems on top of a banter system. So yeah, let's say we weren't going to do an interruption system. How would you gauge at what point a banter should be considered void?
So my experience of that has led me to believe that what we need to be doing is thinking about banter in a very atomic but very contextual way. So to take the naughty dog example, the stories that they tell as they're driving around Lost Legacy are sort of maybe something like 12, 18 lines long. They're relatively long. And they play for a bit and then they get interrupted and they pick it up. The way that I would approach the same thing is I would have each line be individual and fire, and then the next one would say, am I recent to the previous one? That's my contextual allowance to fire for this. And then also treat them as quite disposable. So if the action gets interrupted here, I might not pick up that line ever. I might come in with that line over here, which says, okay, you talked about this bit, but you never mentioned that bit. So let's get the conversation back to that bit. So to try and make that more specific, if the point of this conversation is to teach the player 3 facts, like I used to be a thief, there's a temple over there, I want to steal the thing from the temple. You might have a linear chain of barks that gets you through them, fine. You might have, I used to be a thief over here, that gets cut off by some action. Over here, somebody says, hey, look at that temple over there. And it's an unrelated line that happens to teach the player the same fact. And then when both of those things are in play, you might have a line where someone says, I bet I could steal the thing from that temple right now. So that's getting to the same endpoint via multiple paths by tracking the information. Has the player got it? Has the player not got it? Which sounds massively complicated, but it is what we did in Heaven's Vault, and it's all worked. So it does require a lot of dialogue. One of the things we lean on is that we're mostly text and non-voiced, and we're mostly non-localized. That's very helpful. Not everyone is Larian and can just produce endless streams of content. It's difficult, but I think it's a question of always asking yourself, what's this banter for? Like, if it's just for character, then it's disposable, and that's fine. If it's for telling the player something, why, if you only got one place you're telling the player this thing, if it's important, why not have 4? Why not build some redundancy into it? Why not have a point where if the player really bloody needs to know there's a temple over there and they reach a certain trigger in the world, the characters just literally stop and do it by a cutscene. And that's not the way you do it. That's the way you cope with the player who managed to breeze through all the ways you wanted to do it and use that as a fallback. So there are quite a lot of strategies you can apply once you start breaking it into atoms rather than thinking of it as, here is my page of script that I wrote in Microsoft Word. Here is my page of script in Microsoft Word. So that's, I think, the way that I would start thinking about it.
Thank you. That was much more complex than I hoped.
I think on that bombshell that will end up on my on my gravestone. I think I'd better stop. Thank you very much for coming, everybody.